You're listening to 91.7 FM, WSUW, in Whitewater, Wisconsin. You're listening to Rashkin Report. I'm excited to welcome back to the program Professor of Russian History at UW-Madison, Dr. David McDonald. David, how are you?
Fine, how are you?
I'm doing fantastic. It's been a few months since we've spoken, and I'm curious to hear your opinion because do you feel that historically speaking, anything changed in Russia in the last few months? Or all of those little news headlines that come out of Russia really just kind of signal the same thing? And there's, how newsworthy and how much change there been, do you feel?
Well, it says something about the limits of my and my colleagues' perceptions as outsiders that I see straws in the wind that to me are very interesting and that my Russian friends say really don't mean anything. So, by what do I mean by this? Say we get revelations by a guy like Navalny going through just how wired in this cloud of constituencies around President Putin is in terms of their huge holdings in London, Paris, the Riviera, Italy, often in the names of their children, and that just the increasing visibility of the concentration of wealth and power in this small cadre, very heterogeneous cadre, but nonetheless. And what's striking is the very visibility of it to anybody who wants to see. Same time, and we're at the same time, I would see signs of or conflicting signs in the in what I can gauge of the political mood just reading the newspapers online. That, for instance, the demonstrations by the Danaboyshki, the long-haul truckers, over the winter, over those special monitors that they had to have mounted in their cabs to assess the distance and the road use, and sort of an added levy to the road tax they already paid as part of their license. This occasioned a lot of discontent, as we know, especially as the license or the concession for selling these belonged to the son of one of Putin's best friends. And it seemed to me that was a very interesting confluence of factors. But again, my Russian friend said, it'll come to nothing. And so it is really, then where else do we look? In the Middle East, I think there has been a bit of a change in that the Russian government, the Russian armed forces have obliged the Western coalition to recognize them as a key player in whatever is going to happen in Syria. I think they've been relatively successful from their point of view in establishing themselves as a strategic presence in the area.
So you mean that now, because of what Russia has done in Syria, even though it's not as actively engaged as in the past, it is still considered one of the players, one of the people at the table in all future negotiations about Syria?
I think that's without a doubt. And I think, again, from the point of view of a long distance observer, I think it's arguable that their intervention has been more strategically effective than any support the West was giving to the confederation of liberal or secular allies that had come together against the government, as opposed to the branch plant of Al Qaeda and of course ISIS or ISIL or Daesh or whatever we're going to call it today. But so yeah, there I think they've dealt themselves back in the game. Plus, which, and the one thing I don't know a lot about, and I don't think we examined sufficiently, it's interesting to me that Prime Minister Netanyahu was just in Moscow and very cordial meetings with his counterparts in the Russian government, and that Israel and Russia seem to be developing a warm relationship, and that's and
I think that is a point that really should not be lost in there, is just how not anti-Semitic Russia is right now.
I think that's absolutely so. I think and again, something that a lot of our colleagues in the West associate with the Putin government, but I don't think is necessarily so. You still get these outbreaks of sort of uncontrolled, what do you want to call it, nationalist, right-wing violence.
And, and that's always going to be there. I think the distinction is how much government is feeding and fueling it.
Yeah, and I'm not sure how much it is.
Right. So that's like a good thing.
Yes, I agree. I think the fate of the self-labeled Strelkov from the Donetsk Mятеж, or from the militia in East Ukraine is an example. The New York Times ran a story yesterday or the day before about how he is really being put on an island by the government. He doesn't like it. He models himself on white officers in the Civil War, and we can tell which white officers he models himself on. But I think we have been attributing a lot more control to this government over the forces that we don't like than is maybe the case. And so that's another thing, is I think we've tended to overestimate the instrumentality of this government, just as we did the Soviet state before.
All right. So you're seeing, so I guess what you're saying is actually what things that seem maybe relevant to you as they would be important signs of things to come are dismissed by the Russians. Other things that they feel that are super important that are not making the same resonance that they feel they should, in your opinion? Or how does that, the other channel?
That's a good question, and that I couldn't answer as clearly. There's sort of, there's more a thing of just cultivating your own garden, to quote Voltaire, that people are not trying, and my friends tend to be liberal intelligentsia, so I've got a very limited and very skewed sample of capital cities, highly educated,
right.
But they seem to just be looking for a space in which they can work undisturbed.
Right. And I think that you're absolutely right in a sense that things that are important to Russian people that make their existence more bearable are the things that the West is not necessarily going to care about, because it's kind of like your personal problem. You can't take over a business, then you suffer if you cannot take care of these needs, because West is going to be more concerned about like maybe military impact or, those kinds of things.
Yeah, the strategic thing. And I also think, I think in the bigger picture, right, because this already starts with the Maidan, or actually it's in several phases. It's the 2011, 2012 demonstration, then Maidan. I think we had the impression that, say, the sanctions were going to work, right? And we reckon without...
Well, we at least thought, I would imagine, that they're going to have an effect, and they have.
Well, certainly on day-to-day life, but I think our model is that it would inspire sufficient discontent that the government, or what my friends would call the regime, would feel a certain amount of pressure and relent, and somehow soften on Ukraine or soften in other areas of conflict. And I think I think Westerners, or I think the NATO and the Western Alliance has come up against the resilience and the tooth gritting of the Russian public, especially in the provinces. That one of the messages I've heard over the last couple of years is, and I think it's a very effective one, is for all that people talk about the quote greatest generation here, World War II did not have anywhere near the impact in the United States or North America or even in Great Britain that it had in the Soviet Union, obviously. And being able to appeal to that example of national discipline, forbearance, survival, and patriotism, the implicit message with these sanctions is, okay, so you can't have camembert and nice Rhine wine. Just think of your grandfather, think of your grandmother, and what they went through if they were living in Leningrad, or if they were living in Ukraine, or they lived in, not so much Ukraine, but the Western provinces. Are you really going to complain about not being able to have proper cheese? And I think right now that still has some traction.
So it's kind of a mix of guilt and gratitude.
Yeah, guilt and gratitude. Example, making a virtue out of Russian toughness.
Right.
Sort of playing up a lot of these sort of civic virtues that people had lost sight of during the oil years.
Well, you listed almost a laundry list, I guess, of different things that we can go back to, and I think would be good and important to do that. For instance, the first issue that you pointed out was Navalny's reports on corruption, which I think are fundamental, combined with Panama Papers.
Yes, pardon me.
Yeah, and but but yet people don't seem to, it just further affirms their expectation that everything is owned by somebody else, and this is just how the world works. Thank you very much. We officially been confirmed in our suspicions. Moving on.
And that's actually you go back to your original question about what I'd call the historicity of all of this.
Right.
Again, it's something that a lot of my colleagues don't like, and my Russian colleagues really don't like. But if you look at you look at Soviet society, you probably look at most of late imperial society, or going back all the way back into Muscovy. The broad mass of the population, to use a Russian term, the narod, was always disengaged from politics. That was somebody else's game. An idea of popular sovereignty never, and it's not a deficiency. It's just it was a concept that people didn't have. I won't get into village life, but certainly politics was a game of risk. It was not a game of trust. Trust was located in what we would call informal networks, whether it was Life Nalieva, living on the left, as they say in Soviet times. You had your friends you trusted, and they were networked into things where you could get stuff. But going into politics, there were real consequences if you got the wrong way with somebody. And,
right.
And this broader idea of trust, right? What I always say in my classes is, and to local audiences is, we think somehow what we have is quote unquote natural, right? That this was the outcome of a history that we can trace through, Periclean Athens in the 6th century or 5th century BC. And I always have to remind audiences, well, from Magna Carta, right, 1215, how long did it take to realize the promises that we see in the Magna Carta, right? The rule of law state, trial by jury of the peers, representative government, all the rest of it. Well, let's see. We got War of the Roses, 100 Years' War, War of the Roses, English Civil War, American Revolution, American Civil War, 2 World Wars, and then the Civil Rights Movement. It's not really until 1965 that you have full enfranchisement in theory of all society. That's only 750 years, right? And we've tended to look at Russia and say, and not just Russia, we do this, we've done it with China. You look at Russia and say, well, here's how a constitution is built. Put this in, I'll put it a different way. Right now, 8 senior citizens who'd be retired in any other profession get to make the ultimate determination of the legality of one or another state measure, right? And it's amazing that even if we disagree with the Supreme Court, we tend to obey its findings, right? We tend to invest their findings. And that's partly about trust. It's partly about a lot of things. I don't think that in Russia, that is part of the conceptualization of politics and how it works.
No, I think that because the word there is not trust, but power, vlast.
Vlast and doveria. But doveria is really a word associated with vlast, with confidence or trust. It's not something that the people shows to the government.
Right. And so it seems like it's a population that continually lives under occupation by its own government.
I don't think most people regard it like that. I think it looks
not
like
at all,
that.
Of course.
No, and I think that's the interesting thing. It's very hard. Like whenever I talk about Russia, just as in our conversation, it really becomes an exercise in historical epistemology because and it's a challenge I would face in my classroom. How do you explain to an audience that takes so deeply to heart the quote unquote values that we apparently espouse in this system? How do you convince them that there are people living in Voronezh and in the Glush, in the sticks somewhere, that really feels a stirring in their heart when they see that tricolor flag, when they hear the national anthem, that when they're celebrating Victory Day, this is something they feel, whatever its flaws, is a good thing, right? And they feel a certain loyalty to it. And how do you define that and explain it without making them seem abnormal?
There's an interesting street segment that I saw recently where they're talking about passing a law in Russia that would make it would violate the law if you made fun of or ridiculed the national anthem in some way.
Yeah.
And it turns out that the reporter who was out in the street talking to people, apparently nobody knows the text. So it's this kind of a funny patriotism that's really kind of a lot for show, but it's not necessarily internalized. I don't know.
I think it might be in a couple of registers. I think there's something. I've sat with Russians. I've sat in pubs and that and watched hockey, like Russia playing Canada, right, in ice hockey. There, I can tell you, there's real, genuine patriotism, right?
Yes, and they know all the players.
Yeah. In some ways, by the way, parenthetically, the most interesting thing that's happened over the last 6 months is the doping scandal. But on that more later. But so. There's a certain type of patriotism that you share with your friends and all the rest of it. And then there's a certain type that you are obliged to express when you're in what they'd call the public sphere, when you're in a public setting, when you're face-to-face with representatives of official power. And we have a version of that, too. It's always fascinating to me that in this republic, again, speaking as a Canadian from constitutional monarchy, the reverence that is shown to titles, right? In the current Democratic primary campaign, it's Senator Sanders and Secretary Clinton. Now, why isn't it Senator Clinton or why isn't Hillary? Well, it's Hillary in the campaign literature. But we have this respect for the protocol of these offices and these decorations. And there's a certain type of patriotism you have to, like when Americans sing the national anthem, they all have men have their hands on their hearts, and that who knows what they're feeling inside. But I think again in Russia, it strikes us simply because the demands that are made by that appear to be made by official authority and official observance appear to us to be made. They seem to be observed, but also in the breach, as you noted, that. People don't know the words. It seems sort of formal, and the rest. So it's a very interesting problem.
It is. You're listening to WSUW 91.7 FM, The Edge in Whitewater, Wisconsin. This is Rashkin Report, and I'm your host, Yuri Rashkin. My guest today is Professor of Russian History at UW-Madison, Dr. David McDonald, and we're assessing the situation and hopefully with kind of a bigger picture of things, because a history professor, I think it's always fascinating because it's a much bigger perspective, and I think that it's nice for a show that doesn't attempt to cover everything on minute to minute basis. To why not try to take a step back and take a look. So, what about the doping scandal?
I think it's fascinating as a student of sports, and given the fact that what we call doping originated among Soviet sports scientists, and it was the Soviet Union that invented the discipline of sports medicine, right?
I did not know that, but I'll trust you on that.
Oh, yeah. And then,
it sounds believable in that sense.
Through the 70s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, there was a mini arms race between East German labs and Soviet labs to come up with more stuff. And then in the West, it was sort of like the space race. There are drugs that are developed that show up in weight rooms or show up in bodybuilding clubs, and then they radiate through other sports. And of course, athletics is always about finding an edge. And it tells us something about the metaphorical power of sport as spectacle. That under the Soviet era, and certainly more recently, certainly since 2004 to 2008, the premium that is placed by government on athletics as a demonstration of relative systemic superiority or achievement, right? That one of the things that undoubtedly I think galvanized a lot of popular support for the Soviet Union. One of the things that if I talk to people about the 80s 70s and 80s, and I remember it from being there in the 70s. People took great pride in the fact that Soviet soccer players, hockey players, musicians, directors were as good as anybody in the world. And one of the most visible signs of Soviet collapse and the sort of what the 90s, the big bad 90s as they become now, is not just the total disintegration of the fabric of daily life and infrastructure, but the meteoric fall of Russian sports performance internationally, in everything from track and field to hockey. Well, how long has it been since Russian teams really contended for anything in hockey? Soccer, forget about it. Now Dynamo Kiev is in a different country. They really, I guess they're back in the Euro this year. They had a good run in 2008, but they haven't been in the World Cup for I don't know how long. Oh, I'm sorry, they were there in 2014.
And I think they are likely to be in it in 2018 as the hosts.
They're hosting, yeah.
Right, which always gives you kind of a leg up. But, and I always joke that it's such a terrible tragedy because Russians really love soccer and yet they're so horrible at it. But it is what it is. But I guess to fill in those that, somehow this is I think is a fairly big scandal that really hasn't resonated much out west, has it? Have you noticed much discussion?
Yeah, the IAAF.
Is this all over ESPN? I just haven't been watching ESPN.
No. The IAAF, the International Athletics, Amateur Athletics Federation, or whatever it stands for, they're holding a meeting on a week and a half from now to determine whether or not a Russian team will be invited to take part in Rio.
Oh, I agree. I agree. But I'm saying, have you seen this covered on CNN?
CNN, no, but if you read The Guardian and New York Times, or
all right.
It's getting less. And the fact is, I don't know, we can be cynical about it, or we can see it as a lesson. The Russians are sort of owning this crisis. I think there was a break when this guy Radchenkov, is that how you pronounce it? He's former. He was in charge of doping control in Mutka's ministry, in the Ministry of Sport and Culture. And
is he the one who turned him in, or
he was originally he was the guy that reported to the World Doping, the Dick Pounds, Richard Pounds Authority, and then he came to the States after the first wave of stories broke because he felt somewhat apprehensive about his welfare in Russia, and since then he has been very free with talking about how they did it, what they did, right down to when they were in Sochi. He talked about how they found a workaround for the protocols of storing the urine samples, through which they could replace maybe tainted samples with pure samples.
Yeah, they were able to open unopenable devices to replace urine. And see, that's commitment. That is, that has to be pretty much a state-based industry at that point.
Well, that's what we call science.
Right. And so it could be that Russia will be maybe walking under an Olympic flag or not altogether the Olympics. And
well, from what I can tell, they've got several questions in front of them. Will there be an official Russian team? Or, because there's actually a fair amount of sympathy in the athletic community for the athletes in the Russian Federation who were not doping. And there seems to be some sort of consensus among athletes about who that was, and a sense that it's unfair to these people to be punished for the misdeeds of others. And so would there be a way to accommodate them? But it's going to be a very, if you have any listeners and viewers who are interested in sport, this is a really interesting showcase of the value that all sorts of countries place on sport as some sort of metaphorical reflection of this society's accomplishments. Same thing, the third rail now in international relations, I would suspect, and there were noises made about it 2 years ago after the Malaysian airliner was shot down over Ukraine, is 2018 going to take place in Russia? And
time is running out, and not all the stadiums are built either.
No, we know that too, but I think it would be I think it just would be hugely destructive in all sorts of ways to move it now. But I wouldn't exclude it as an alternative that somebody's thinking about.
Well, I would imagine, frankly, considering that the conversation about moving World Cup from Russia has been going on since Crimea in 2014, then I would imagine there's Plan B and Plan C, and they're all ready to pull the trigger if they need to. Well, of course, I think England is mentioned as one of the possible replacements.
Yes, because they were the spurned suitor for both 2018 and 2022. I suppose my money would be more on, is Qatar going to have the games than the World Cup than if Russia. But we'll see. It bears watching.
Indeed. All right. So let's jump a little bit back to the not even necessarily the corruption situation, because I think that's, we touched on that, but the clan environment, that there is a certain, it's not just a caste, but the small number of people that are really taking over the resources and are looking at the country as this kind of like a mine that they just kind of, own pretty much. You have Putin, his kid, his daughters, there's a husband and a small cadre of people from St. Petersburg. Historically speaking, do you feel this is sustainable?
Again, depends on the engagement of the population, right? And how would it become unsustainable? What would happen to make this? There's all sorts of responses to this. It's always been like that. We know these guys are crooks, but there are crooks. And also, it's more the homies around Putin are only one group. There's other institutional actors that are benefiting in their own way from the monetization of power, right? And that's, if we want a difference between the Soviet Union and now, I think that's the biggest difference, is that there's the monetization of authority has become thoroughgoing in a way. Under the Soviet state, it was access to certain privileges, certain services that the nomenclatura got that other people didn't have, but they were still paid rather modestly.
So the carrots were much smaller.
Carrots were smaller, but they were valued more for the fact that they were smaller. And True. Now it's this, it's sort of the institutionalization of what they used to call the new Russians. But there's other actors that have ridden this wave and that are important players. The armed services. We're seeing the armed services restored towards a level that the Red Army had achieved by the early 1980s, or the Soviet armed forces. FSB, the Russian Church, the Orthodox Church. You want the winner since 1991, hands down, I would say it's the Orthodox Church, and a very staunch ally of state power, and also a huge beneficiary of there I'm speaking Trump, but it's been a very large beneficiary of the transfer of property that used to belong to the church back to the church. So that we see the Rotenburgs and the Blizhny, the intimates of Putin, benefiting in a certain form of conspicuous consumption, but there are other people, other institutions that are involved that are also riding this wave and that are being very well taken care of for reasons that people, outside observers, could say, well, that makes sense. So,
well, it's another form of trickle-down economics where just the wealth goes down to the next level. But do you feel that something like this can last into unforeseeable future, or do you feel that the situation is headed for a more drastic change? How close do you feel a tipping point of sorts is in this type of a scenario?
Well, that's a big question that that we haven't faced really since 1991. We always used to envision, I think it's something we share with a lot of Russians, or used to share with a lot of Russians. We've had this narrative that this sort of pressure cooker version of historical transformation, that these discontents and grievances accumulate to a point of unsustainability, and boom, blows up and you get a revolution.
Right.
Well, you're dealing with a society that went through three revolutions in a period of 12 years, right? 1905, 1917, February, and 1917, October, and then the revolution from above of the 20s and 30s, and then various forms. But this apotheosization of revolution as a historical moment, and I'm not sure revolution has the traction for a lot of Russians. That
oh no, not at all. From my conversations, I had a conversation with Lev Schlossberg, who pointed out that Russia is just not ready for a bloodless revolution.
No,
so I think revolution is a really like almost a scary word. It's the monster in the closet.
Yeah, no, I think it's something that they sort of say, well, been there, done that, and especially they look to Ukraine. You had the Orange Revolution 2004. You have the Maidan, and
all fairly peaceful, even Maidan.
Oh, sure. Oh, no, I agree. But they look at what did it bring, right? And so I'm looking in the papers. What's her name? Savchenko goes back to Ukraine, and she's now in a pissing match with Yulia Tymoshenko, right? Plus ça change, and it's the same cast of characters. That if I were a Russian looking at Ukraine, I'd say, so all that Sturm und Drang, what did it accomplish? You look at Kyrgyzstan, you look at Georgia. They feel bad about Serbia for reasons that have to do with Russian historical imagination, but I'm not sure revolution is a concept that really, and they tried their own, right? 1991 in many ways was a revolution after the failed putsch and the mobilization and also I think the way revolution is imagined, at least going to thinking of colleagues talking about it, is something that's mass mobilization, it's crowds in the street, it's the way people imagine the Bastille, and the Bastille wasn't like that. It's the way people imagine 1917. 1917 wasn't really like that. It was, except maybe in February, early March. But and I don't see that happening. So to get back to your original question, what's the tipping point? I think one possible tipping point is a generation that's in their 20s, mid-20s right now, or late 20s, that experienced some of the boom, the go-go economy of the first decade of the 21st century, and is now seeing this. People that feel at home on the internet can recognize trolls. There you might see something, but again, if 1991 is the model, they just might want recognition rather than agency, right?
It's interesting because, well, first of all, I think with the young people, I have a feeling that they're more susceptible to immigration. It appears that anybody that is capable realizes that their skills are going to be worth something elsewhere, as far west as they can go. And some just go to Baltics, and I think that's where a lot of protest-minded people are. Yeah. But Eastern, Central, Western Europe, and then maybe U.S. if you're lucky. It's really interesting to see that just this kind of squeezing out of the disagreeables by any means. But
that's
I think.
A good point.
And you bring up a very interesting, I was kind of always thinking, I guess, about the revolution as the pain of it. And you're talking about, but like, what's the result? Yeah. And I think that there's two distinct different problems. Oh,
absolutely. There's a classic song by The Who from the early 1970s, I Won't Get Fooled Again. And it's about this problem. The last line is, meet the new boss the same as the old boss. And it's very, people, we've got these myths about transformation, about systemic transformation. Think of Peter the Great, think of the way we talk about France or 1917. And there are ways in which transformation, or the United States, there are ways in which they take place, and they're very sweeping. On the other hand, they seem to take place within a conceptual framework that remains quite stable. Say in the Russian case, the idea that the state is a historical actor independent of other variables. And that's an idea that we see in Germany and in Central Europe until the Allies, including the Soviet Union, annihilate that state system in 1945, right? It's really hard to reimagine traditions that you think are natural.
Well, yes, and also, I mean, that's a really big picture. I was thinking a slightly smaller picture of the idea that there's the good Tsar and the bad royalty,
Oh, sure.
and which is also a very natural idea. And how do you rebel against that?
And no, exactly, yeah, because they're the source of legitimacy. We have that as well, right? It first became evident to me in the 1980s when there was President Reagan was in power, and he had started veered towards the center in areas of social policy, and that in which he'd been quite strident during his campaigns. And there grew this trope saying, "Let Reagan be Reagan," because they blamed all these deviations, conservatives blamed on his evil advisors, which is all very familiar sounding to when you think of myths about the Tsar's power in before Peter, even after Peter, that somehow the ruler was surrounded by evil advisors who didn't tell him the truth. If he only knew the truth.
Right, and I see it in reporting in today's Russia, where I see there was a one maybe even a year ago where, well, I think it might be happening on probably regular occasions. People gather, the representatives of law enforcement show up, tell them that there's no problem, go away, and then they start like waving Putin's pictures, saying, "Come on, please, that's our protector,"
Yep,
so that everybody's using Putin to their own means.
Well, and that's a very complex sort of action as well, because you're protecting yourself, whether or not they believe. And that's a big problem when we're looking at things like peasant rebellions, Pugatrovщина in Russia, or the Jacquerie and similar revolts in other parts of Europe. People will say they're doing it on behalf of the monarch, just to say Bloody Sunday in 1905. Now, do they really believe that, or is this a way of saying you can't touch us because this is for the ultimate legitimacy of the system? And are they instrumentalizing that for other purposes, even if unconsciously? It's these are really, again, this gets to historical epistemology. It's really hard to figure out, to quote Von Ranke, what really happened.
You're listening to WSUW 91.7 FM, The Edge in Whitewater, Wisconsin. This is Rashkin Report, and I'm your host, Yuri Rashkin. My guest today is a professor of Russian history at UW-Madison, Dr. David McDonald. David, the last area that I wanted to just kind of get your take on, speaking about today's Russia, which is, I think, is just a wonderful, tale for us here to learn some lessons from, if such thing is possible, that we can learn lessons from others in general. But there's people living, and they seem to be living day to day, and yet it is a life that I think most of us here would recognize as I think fairly bizarre by the laws of existence that they're supposed to follow. But as people currently seem to have less and less control over the direction of the policy of the state, and they have really seem to be no hope for change in the state and in government of any sort. I mean, there's elections coming up, but it doesn't sound like really anybody's expecting anything to change from that. I've noticed a theme of magic, where the liberals are hoping for maybe a black swan, maybe some kind of a miraculous event, because there's really no, like, a short of act of God, nothing, they don't feel like anything's going to change in the country. And then on the other hand, I see Putin doing the same thing, where he feels like he's got his security apparatus everywhere, but you never know. And so he's being superstitious. He's going to Greece, to that mountain that's relevant. A fun mountain, and pays, his, the holy trips and whatever, Hajj.
What they've done with Crimea. What
they've done with Crimea. The fact that he's been shown on pictures wearing these red threads on his wrist, which also are sign of this, trying to avert a miracle from happening. What are your thoughts on all of that?
Well, at the risk of offending my liberal friends, this idea of magic is not new. And it's actually a pretty traditional stance, I would say, for people who envision a different type of Russia. Going back to the 19th century, that they wouldn't say it's magic. They say it's this zakon mirnus. It's the idea that history is a law-governed process. It operates according to its own impeti, right, that realize themselves in social consciousness and social progress and all the rest of it. And when you've gone from one stage to the next, everything sort of has to change by historical mandate or imperative. And so liberals in the beginning of the 20th century, after the revolution in 1905, thought, okay, we're done with a certain type of monarchy. If we look at Germany and France and Great Britain and Belgium and Bulgaria, we can see that historical laws dictate that these things have to change. The Soviets also espoused a certain type of historical magic, that if we did this, if we built the conditions for mature socialism, then social relations would change automatically, right? Just by
so they were looking for communist magic.
Yeah. Oh, but it's you're letting these invisible forces do the heavy lifting for you, right?
Right.
And it's understandable if you're a guy like Alexander Gertsen or even Pavel Milyukov, a late imperial historian and political leader, you tend to be aware of the coercive resources of the state. If you're same as your Solzhenitsyn or Sakharov in the 70s, so yeah, the idea of magic for Putin, magic is the return of $80 oil, and there's this hope against hope that will return. But in the meantime, don't let any potential resource go unused. And it's a way, it's one thing that I don't think we give Putin credit for, or that we see him through a lens that we now associate with the presumptive Republican nominee for the presidency of the United States, is his ability to communicate effectively with his constituency, who tend to be lower middle class, working class populations outside of Moscow, Peter, Nizhny, Irkutsk, Novosibirsk. But outside of that, when you go to a place like Tula or down in the steppe, these are his peeps, and he's very good at showing them he's one of them. The red threads, his use of vernacular when he's doing these national call-in shows, right? His annual sort of question and answer period. His ability to embody a certain patriarchal vision of power that a lot of people find familiar, sympathetic. He's our guy, and he, for whatever, going back to an earlier discussion, for whatever shenanigans his entourage gets up to, he is still our guy, and he understands us. And so superstition, there's a lot. Well, what do you do in the absence of hope? And again, if I'm a Russian liberal and I look at Ukraine, like my whole idea of history is around and I think it's something that a lot of us in the West or outside of Russia share. There's this process by which you get a public sphere, right, an area where free speech, where people can communicate and exchange ideas freely. You get coffee shops, pubs, whatever, public squares, and people can exchange political views without fear of repression or violence. And eventually, you get this idea of a civil society, right? And this is something Grajdanskaya Общественность, we hear it a lot in Russia, or we did in the 90s. And then eventually that leads to the idea of people being able to imagine themselves as a self-governing community. And at that point, this authoritarian state power becomes historically irrelevant, right? And that's how that's how Adam Smith tells us we got to be so enlightened and progressive and rich. And that's the way French revolutionaries envisioned what was going on. It's the way the Germans codified for themselves what happened in France as the Germans were hoping for their own national state. And Russian intelligentsia and Soviet intelligentsia had this same vision. Well, you look at Ukraine, the most engaged civil society in the post-Soviet space, right? We'll discount the Baltic states because that was a very unpleasant, but the Soviet power never really took much root there. But you think of Ukraine, here you've got a civil society that should have brought in a self-governing rule of law state. And what's it brought? Again, if you're a Russian sitting in Peter or Nizhny and you look at the government today and you go, these guys are just as corrupt as Vladimir Vladimirovich and company in Moscow. Like, where do you look for magic? Where do you look for historical magic in that?
Well, I think Ukraine supposedly is looking at Moldova, and Russia is looking at Ukraine, and everybody's hoping that some smaller place where things are not as big as in Russia will show somebody the way.
And of course, to me, again, as Canadian, what's intriguing and looking back again to the 90s, at a time when Russians might constructively have looked at Sweden or France, they were looking at the United States as a way of what a successful, mighty society should be. Just like in the old days, they looked at Great Britain, and now.
So rather than look down, look up.
Rather than look for scale, look for possibility. Like, I think the United States was appealing because they had survived seemingly unscathed by the Cold War, and they sort of did everything in a way that the United States and Russia have been paired in a lot of historical comparisons since Tocqueville in the 19th century. And this here was a great power. It corresponded to Russian sense, and the widely held sense, I think, that Russia is a big historical player, whereas Sweden, that's just a second-rate state. They're just they're not the kind of state that we should be, and and plus which we were always happy to help with unsolicited advice and putting money where it wasn't needed instead of where it was, etc. So,
all right, David, thank you so much for this conversation. I look forward to continuing it in the future.
My pleasure, Yuri. Always happy to talk with you.
You're listening to 91.7 FM, WSUW, in Whitewater, Wisconsin. You're listening to Rashkin Report.